The highway stretched endlessly before me, a black ribbon cutting through the barren desert. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. I had been driving for hours, my body aching from the monotony of the road. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, flickering dimly with the strain of age. I had meant to get them fixed weeks ago, but time and money always seemed to slip away from me. It was the kind of night where the world felt abandoned. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like hours, just me and the whispering wind pressing against my truck. My eyelids grew heavy, but I forced them open, shifting in my seat to keep myself awake. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A car, dead center in the middle of the road, its hazard lights blinking like a desperate heartbeat. The passenger door stood wide open, gaping into the void. I slammed my brakes, my tires screaming against the asphalt as my massive rig lurched to a stop mere feet from the vehicle. My pulse thundered in my ears. My first thought was an accident. Maybe someone needed help. But as I scanned the road, there was no sign of a driver, no movement at all. Just the rhythmic clicking of the hazards cutting through the silence. I hesitated. Something wasn't right. I should have kept driving. That's what my gut told me. But there was a strange pull, a gnawing curiosity that forced my hand. Against my better judgment, I threw my truck into park, grabbed a flashlight from the console, and stepped out onto the lonely stretch of road. The air was still, too still. No wind, no distant animal calls, just the oppressive quiet of the desert at night. I approached the car cautiously, my boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. It was a newer model sedan, sleek and well-maintained, which made it even stranger that it was abandoned in the middle of nowhere. I peered inside. The interior was immaculate. No spilled drinks, no bags of fast food, nothing to indicate anyone had been traveling in it. I checked the back seat. Empty. The ignition. The keys were still in it. I cast a glance over my shoulder, scanning the darkness beyond my headlights. A cold prickle crawled up my spine. Someone had been here. Maybe they still were. That's when I noticed the trunk. I tried the handle. Locked. A quiet dread began curling in my stomach. I reached into the car, grabbing the keys from the ignition, and unlocked the trunk. I expected to find a spare tire, maybe some scattered belongings. Instead, I found 3 garbage bags. They were packed tightly together, bulging at unnatural angles, as though something had been stuffed inside with brute force. A thick rope secured the trunk's interior, binding the contents in place. The moment my fingers brushed against the plastic, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Then, a gunshot. The crack of it split the silence like a bolt of lightning. I recoiled, slamming my head on the edge of the trunk in my panic. My vision blurred for a second, but I didn't need to see clearly to know what I had to do. I dropped the keys back into the front seat, yanked the door shut, and staggered backward. A voice, harsh and ragged, yelled from somewhere in the dark. "Hey!" The word was stretched with rage and desperation. Footsteps. Heavy, rapid, coming closer. I turned and ran. My truck loomed like a lifeline ahead of me. My pulse pounded so loudly I could barely hear the engine as I fumbled for the door. Behind me, the footsteps were gaining. I could feel the presence, the raw intensity of something barreling toward me. I threw myself into the cab, my hand shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. My truck stalled. Come on, come on, come on. Finally, the engine roared to life. As I threw it into gear, my headlights illuminated a figure standing just beyond the reach of the truck's shadow. A short, husky man. His hair was wild and red, curling beneath the brim of an old cap. He was wearing grimy overalls, mud caked up to his knees. In one hand, he gripped a rusted shovel. In the other, an old hunting rifle. Our eyes met. There was no wild, frenzied look in his gaze. No madness. Just worry. He dropped the shovel, his mouth moving soundlessly before he finally screamed. Wait. I didn't. I stomped the gas pedal, my truck groaning as it lurched forward. The man ran alongside it for a few seconds before stopping abruptly. I watched in the side mirror as he sprinted back toward his car. And then, headlights. Blinding. Barreling toward me. He was chasing me. My hands clenched the wheel, my knuckles turning bone white. The desert blurred past as I pushed my rig faster than it had ever gone before. Behind me, the car kept pace, its high beams cutting into my mirrors. I had no plan, no idea what I was going to do. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let me leave. I gritted my teeth, my hands slick with sweat as I clutched the wheel. The man in the car behind me wasn't giving up. His high beams pulsed wildly, flashing on and off, erratic like a distress signal or some kind of demented Morse code. My truck thundered down the highway, the rig shuddering under the weight of my speed. Then, the honking started. Long, desperate blasts, over and over, as if he were trying to tell me something. I didn't care. This man had just fired a gun at me. He had chased me down, tried to block me off. No way in hell was I pulling over. But then, a second set of headlights. My stomach dropped as another vehicle appeared in the distance ahead, coming fast. Panic shot through me. Was he not alone? Did he have backup waiting? I scanned the road. No intersections. No exits. This road cut through the desert like a scar, nothing but darkness and dust for miles. If someone was coming, it meant they had been waiting. I was driving straight into a trap. My truck groaned as I slowed just slightly, trying to gauge the approaching vehicle. It wasn't a sedan like the one chasing me. It was something bigger, a truck maybe, headlights glaring, moving at an alarming speed. The car behind me honked again. The lights ahead swerved into my lane. I had no choice. I yanked the wheel hard, my tires screaming as my massive rig lurched onto the shoulder. Gravel and dust exploded around me as I fought to control the truck, barely managing to keep it steady as the other vehicle shot past. For a split second, the world seemed frozen, and in that moment, I saw the driver of the other vehicle, a woman, her face pale and stretched in a scream, her hands clutching the wheel in terror. She wasn't trying to stop me. She was trying to escape, and she wasn't alone. Something was in the back seat. I barely had time to register the movement, a dark shape, too large to be a person, twisting in the shadows behind her. A flash of something gleaming in the moonlight. Then she was gone. Her car hurtled past me, vanishing into the blackness of the desert highway. And just like that, the man behind me slammed on his brakes. I watched in the mirror as he veered off the road, his tires kicking up clouds of dust. His car skidded to a stop, rocking slightly before the driver's side door flew open. He stepped out, shoulders heaving, staring down the highway where the woman had disappeared. Then he looked at me. I had never been more confused or terrified in my life. Because the rage that had been in his eyes moments before, it was gone, replaced by something else. Fear. I didn't stop to ask questions. I hit the gas, my truck roaring back onto the highway. The man didn't chase me. He just stood there, watching me go, his rifle hanging limp at his side. I drove for hours, my brain whirling, my hands trembling against the wheel. I didn't know what I had just seen. I didn't know why the man had chased me, why he had been so desperate to stop me. But I knew one thing. Whatever had been in the back of that woman's car, it wasn't human, and I had almost driven straight into it. Story 2. The road stretched endlessly before me, the only movement coming from the soft, rhythmic flicker of my turn signal as I changed lanes. It was just past 2 a.m., and the world had shrunk to the narrow stretch of asphalt illuminated by my truck's headlights. The night was thick, smothering, with no moon to break the ink-black sky. I had been driving for nearly 12 hours, delivering machinery parts across 3 states. I was running on fumes, my energy drained after too much coffee and too little sleep. But the thought of pulling over felt worse. Rest stops creeped me out at this hour, too quiet, too empty, too much room for something to go wrong. The isolation was getting to me. Then, up ahead, I spotted something that made my breath hitch. A lone figure stood at the edge of the road, bathed in my headlights, staring right at me. A hitchhiker. My heart hammered as I slowed instinctively, but I didn't stop. Something about him made my skin crawl. He was tall, gaunt, dressed in a loose hoodie and tattered jeans, his hands buried in his pockets. His face was shadowed, unreadable. As I passed, he did something that nearly made me swerve. He lifted one arm and pointed. Not at me, not at my truck, at something in the distance. I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes on the road. In my mirror, I expected to see him growing smaller, fading into the night like a forgotten nightmare. But he didn't. He was still there. Not walking, not running, just standing. I checked again a few seconds later. He was gone. I shivered, forcing myself to focus. Probably just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a lost traveler, some drifter waiting for a ride. Still, I couldn't shake the image of his outstretched arm, pointing. 15 minutes later, I saw what he had been pointing at. A gas station. It was an old one, the kind that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. A single, flickering neon sign buzzed dully above the pumps. But the strangest part? The lights inside were on. That shouldn't have been strange, but something about it unsettled me. I hadn't seen a single car for over an hour, not even parked at the station. It just sat there, glowing in the dark, waiting. I debated passing it, but my energy was running dangerously low. If I didn't grab a coffee or an energy drink soon, I'd be dozing off behind the wheel. I pulled into the lot, my tires crunching on loose gravel. The place looked abandoned, but as I stepped out, I noticed movement inside. A figure behind the counter. Relieved, I headed toward the entrance, pushing the door open. A small bell jingled above me. The store smelled like stale air and dust. Rows of shelves stood half empty, stocked with outdated snacks and faded drink labels. The coolers hummed against the far wall, their glass doors foggy. The cashier didn't look up. He was an older man, his head tilted downward, eyes locked on the counter. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. Hey, I said, forcing a casual tone. You guys still open? No response. I frowned. The man was breathing, but he was unnervingly still. I slowly made my way to the fridge section, glancing at the warped reflection of myself in the foggy glass. I grabbed an energy drink, my fingers trembling slightly, though I wasn't sure why. Then I noticed something strange. The reflection behind me. The cashier was staring at me now, but not at my back. At my reflection. I turned sharply. He wasn't looking at me. His head was still down, his face slack. But in the glass, his reflection was smiling. My breath caught in my throat. I staggered backward, the drink slipping from my fingers and hitting the floor with a dull thud. The sound seemed to snap the room back into motion. The cashier let out a wet, shuddering breath, as if he had been holding it the entire time. Then he spoke. You shouldn't be here. My skin prickled. What? Get in your truck, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Go now. I took a step back, glancing toward the door. Something in my gut told me to listen. Then, the bell above the entrance jingled again. Someone else had just walked in. I turned, expecting to see another traveler. But it wasn't. It was the hitchhiker. The same one I had passed on the road, his hoodie still damp with night air. He looked at me, then at the cashier. And he smiled. That's when the lights cut out. The store plunged into darkness. My breath hitched as the hum of the coolers died, leaving only the hollow silence of the night pressing against my ears. My pulse thundered, my body frozen in place. Then movement. A soft scuff of shoes against the floor. The hitchhiker was still there. I knew it. I could feel him even though I couldn't see him. Then, the cashier whispered, his voice barely a breath in the void. Don't move. I stood stock still, my hands clenched at my sides, my heart hammering against my ribs. My eyes strained to adjust, but the darkness in the store was too complete, too suffocating. And then, I heard it. A sound from somewhere near the entrance. Not footsteps. Something else. A clicking. Faint, rapid, like long nails tapping against glass. I swallowed hard, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. And then, just as suddenly as it had vanished, the light snapped back on. The fluorescent glow buzzed overhead, flickering for a moment before stabilizing. My vision swam as I took in the scene around me. The cashier was gone. The counter was empty, the space behind it abandoned as if no one had ever been there. My brain struggled to make sense of it. I had just heard him. I had seen him. But now? It was like he had never existed. And the hitchhiker. He was still standing by the door. Only now, his hoodie had slipped back, revealing his face fully for the first time. And my blood ran ice cold. He looked exactly like me. Every detail, my short-cropped hair, my stubble, even the tiny scar on my chin from a childhood fall. It was like staring into a warped mirror, a version of myself standing just a few feet away. He grinned, a slow, eerie smile that stretched too wide, his teeth just a little too sharp. Looks like I caught up to you, he murmured. I staggered back, my mind scrambling for an explanation. A hallucination? A prank? No, this was something else. Something wrong. Then, the clicking started again. I turned, my gaze snapping toward the glass doors. The windows were covered in handprints. Dozens of them, smudging the glass, their fingers longer than they should have been, reaching, pressing against the surface as if trying to find a way inside. My lungs clenched. The prints were fresh. They hadn't been there before the lights went out. The hitchhiker let out a low chuckle. You should have kept driving, he said. I bolted. I didn't think. I just ran. My feet pounded against the tile as I burst out the door, my truck looming in the lot like a beacon. The air was cold, wrong, like it had been drained of everything living. I yanked the door open, throwing myself into the cab, my hands shaking as I jammed the keys into the ignition. The truck roared to life. In the store window, the hitchhiker, my twin, watched me, still smiling. Then he raised a single hand and pointed. Behind me, a shadow shifted in my mirrors. I didn't look. I couldn't. I hit the gas. My tires screeched as I tore out of the lot, the neon glow of the gas station vanishing in my rear view. I drove blind, barely thinking, just getting as far away as I could. It wasn't until miles later that I finally glanced back. The road was empty. No cars. No headlights. Nothing. But the handprints. They were still on my truck's rear window. And they weren't mine. Story 3. I had been driving for nearly 16 hours straight, my eyelids heavy as the endless highway stretched before me. The road was empty. Nothing but a black expanse cutting through the wilderness. My GPS told me I still had 3 more hours to go before I could even think about stopping. I hated these late-night hauls, but the pay was too good to pass up. A straight shot across state lines, no complicated drop-offs, no need to interact with people. Just me, my rig, and the road. But the isolation, it does something to you. The mind starts playing tricks when all you have is the hum of the engine and the rhythmic flash of mile markers in the dark. So when I saw the purple dress lying crumpled in the middle of the highway, I nearly dismissed it as a hallucination. My fingers gripped the wheel tighter as I slowed, my truck's headlights washing over the fabric. It was delicate, almost shimmering under the harsh light. Then, a few feet ahead, a pair of shoes. I swallowed hard. A dress. Shoes. Where was the person? A cold prickle crawled up my spine. I scanned the darkness outside my cab, the road stretching endlessly into nothing. No cars. No lights. I inched forward, my truck rolling past the clothing. And that's when I saw the handprints. They were smeared across the asphalt, faint streaks of red leading toward the tree line at the edge of the highway. The prints were erratic, like someone had been dragged. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe it was exhaustion dulling my common sense. Or maybe I was just too damn stubborn for my own good. I flipped on my hazard lights, put the rig in park, and climbed out of the cab. The night air was still. No wind. No crickets. Just silence. I approached the dress cautiously, my breath hitching when I noticed something else. A small silver locket half buried in the dirt beside it. I bent down and picked it up, my fingers brushing against something sticky on the chain. Dried blood. My stomach knotted. I thumbed the locket open, half expecting to see an old photograph inside. But there wasn't one. Instead, there was a piece of paper, folded so tightly it had nearly fused to the metal. I pried it open, squinting at the hastily scrawled words. Do not follow. A twig snapped. The sound was soft, too soft. But in the dead silence of the night, it was like a gunshot. I froze, my breath coming shallow and fast. My eyes darted toward the tree line, but all I could see was darkness. Then, another sound. Footsteps, coming from the forest. Slow, deliberate. Someone, or something, was coming toward me. I took a shaky step back, my mind racing. This was wrong. All of it was wrong. I turned on my heel and sprinted back to my truck. As I climbed into the cab, my headlights caught movement at the edge of the trees. A figure stepped out. It was a woman. Her dress matched the one on the ground. Same color, same silky material. But she wasn't wearing shoes. Her feet were bare, raw, covered in scratches as if she had been running through the woods for miles. Her face was obscured by her tangled black hair, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. I gripped the door handle, my gut screaming at me to go. Then, she lifted her hand and pointed behind me. My entire body went cold. I didn't want to turn around, but I did. And there, standing in the middle of the highway where the dress had been, was another woman, identical to the first, identical in every way. Even the torn feet, even the dress, 2 versions of the same person, standing on opposite sides of me. The locket in my hand felt like it was burning my skin. My breath came in short gasps. The 2 figures took a step forward in unison. Then another. I slammed the door shut and threw the truck into gear. As I sped off, I glanced in my side mirror one last time. They were both still there, but they weren't watching me anymore. They were walking toward each other and merging into one. The moment they touched, the headlights on my truck flickered, and I wasn't on the highway anymore. The road had vanished. I was driving through a dark, endless forest. The last thing I saw in my mirror was a single, small silver locket hanging in midair before the darkness swallowed it whole. The road was gone. I gripped the wheel, my breath ragged, my pulse hammering against my skull. My truck should have been on the highway. I had been driving on it just seconds ago. But now, the asphalt had vanished beneath my tires. In its place was an endless forest. My headlights cut through the trees, revealing a narrow dirt path winding ahead of me. Massive trunks stretched skyward, their branches twisted and knotted like grasping hands. The air was thick with fog, curling unnaturally in the glow of my lights. This was impossible. I slammed on the brakes. The truck groaned as it skidded to a stop, the silence outside pressing against the cab like a living thing. I fumbled for my GPS, my hands trembling. The screen flickered, static dancing across it before the words appeared. No route found. My breath hitched. I shifted into reverse, my tires spinning in the dirt, but the truck wouldn't move. It was as if something beneath me was holding it in place. Then, a whisper. Low, drawn out. It came from the trees, curling through the night like fingers slipping across my skin. I swallowed hard. I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned my head toward the side mirror, and my stomach dropped. There was something behind my truck. A shadow stood at the very edge of the red glow of my taillights, its form impossibly tall, its limbs too long. It was watching me. I couldn't make out its face, but I could see its hands. They weren't empty. They held the silver locket, the same one I had picked up from the road. Only now, the chain was dripping. My fingers tightened around the wheel. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, to run, to fight, to do anything. Then tapping. I stiffened. It was coming from inside the cab. Not the window. Not the door. The curtain behind my seat. Something was inside my truck. The air turned razor thin, a thick silence stretching between my gasping breaths. My fingers trembled as I reached for the latch on the curtain. One pull. That's all it would take. I hesitated. And then, the curtain yanked itself open. I screamed. For the briefest second, I saw it. A woman, hunched and broken, crammed into the tiny space behind my seat. Her jaw was too wide. Her eyes were too empty. Her hands, they weren't hands anymore. They had stretched, elongated into something that no longer belonged to a person. Something meant for tearing. Then she moved. A blur of limbs lunged forward. I didn't think. I threw myself out of the truck. I hit the ground hard, my knees scraping against the rough dirt. The truck's engine was still running, its headlights illuminating the thick forest ahead. I staggered to my feet, my entire body screaming in pain. My breath was ragged, my mind spiraling. Where do I go? What do I do? Then, a familiar sound. A clink. The locket. I turned, and there it was, dangling from a low-hanging branch. As if it was waiting for me. A gust of wind rushed through the trees, whispering in a voice that wasn't quite human. You picked it up. The words weren't spoken. They slithered into my ears, winding through my skull like smoke. I took a shaky step backward, and then I saw her. The woman. She stood just beyond the reach of my headlights. Her jaw still unhinged, her body still too wrong. Only now, she was wearing the dress. The same dress I had found on the road. Her head tilted, her gaze locking onto me. And then, she smiled. Not a grin. Not something human. Something meant to make me break. My feet moved before my brain caught up. I ran. I ran deeper into the woods. Branches tore at my arms, my legs screaming with pain as I sprinted blindly. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. But then, the ground vanished beneath me. I was falling. The world spun as I tumbled, my body colliding with something hard and cold. Pain exploded through me. My vision blurred. And then, I hit asphalt. Silence. I gasped, my lungs heaving for air. My palms scraped against the rough surface. My head pounded as I slowly sat up. I was on the highway. My truck was parked on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking. The road stretched before me, empty and familiar. No trees. No whispers. No woman. I scrambled to my feet, my body trembling. Had I imagined it? Had I fallen asleep at the wheel? Then, a single silver locket, lying at my feet, the chain dripping,